I think we'll start now, and if people will march in, well, then they will. Okay, so first of all, thank you for coming and being interested in this super hot topic of polarization, which is definitely shows its popularity with the amount of people in the room. But no, I'm kidding. It is a super important topic, and I think this is part of the motivation that I had to conduct this activity. So first things first, this activity will be recorded. So while I didn't plan it to be basically a lecture, it's going to be more of a lecture, just so you will feel more comfortable if you don't want to share your opinions and stuff like that. I think what we'll do is we'll do about 50 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes at the end to discuss things more thoroughly, maybe with the cameras off. But having said that, please feel free to stop me anytime during the presentation, ask questions, raise ideas, whatever, clarifications, or just your thoughts, because I really want it to be more of a discussion than a lecture. But again, I don't want to put anyone on the spot here, so just know that. So yes, with that note, let's get going. So this is basically planned to be a 2-session activity, today and next week. And today we're going to talk about what is polarization in general, more conceptually speaking. What are the practical aspects of polarization? How can we actually perceive it in our everyday life? And we're going to talk a little bit about who is polarized, because polarization, interestingly enough, actually occurs on different levels of society. And next week we're going to talk a little bit more about why polarization occurs, and we're going to talk how can we fix it, if we even want to fix it, which is also an interesting question to think about. So I'm not assuming any prior knowledge. This is basically just general audience activity. I'm not promising you that you're going to leave with answers or major, okay, now we're going to do that. But I do hope that you'll get a deeper understanding of the concept of polarization, or at least of why it's important to really dig a little bit deeper and to try to understand what is the thing that we talk about and we see all these headlines on. So before we delve into that, and just let me know if you don't want to share, but if you would like to share where polarization meets you, what do you think about when I say, ooh, we're polarized, or what do you think about polarization in general? Maybe what were your motivation to come to this activity, if anyone cares to share?
Yeah, I'm really interested in just so I'm a U.S. Army cyber officer, so I'm really involved in essentially how information operations encourage more polarization. So I was really intrigued to kind of learn more about the foundation of it, instead of the technical ways that we measure it.
Great.
I'm here just from reading the news every day, and I feel so much of it is focused on political polarization in the U.S. right now. So I saw this and I thought it'd be interesting to learn more.
Yes, that's definitely that. I'll get to that in a second.
I'm a linguistic anthropologist. I basically study how people take up new moral attitudes through kind of their engagement with memes and all sorts of silly online products. And a lot of the language kind of that people apply to what I do is oh, you're looking at polarization. And it seems very much a yes, but also some of the divides that I'm looking at and the bridges don't mirror kind of poles, if you will, of left-right. So I was really interested in kind of having a conversation of how do we understand polarization if it's not necessarily this neat right-left divide.
Okay, great. So I'm hopefully each of you will find something interesting in this session, even in just this session, but hopefully in the next as well. So just as you mentioned, polarization is on the rise, right? So we constantly face those headlines saying American politics is divided. We get those cool, neat red, blue bulks moving sideways across each other throughout the years. We have those amazing amounts of polls saying that Republicans hate Democrats and Democrats hate Republicans. They demonstrate rising levels of antipathy towards each other. And we have polarization rising not only in the US, even though most of the research that we read here is focused on the US, but we see that levels of polarization are also rising in Europe. We see the rise of right-wing politics in Spain, in Italy, we see it in the Middle East, and we know that polarization is on the rise, okay? But the question is, why? Why polarization is on the rise, and also why focusing so much on polarization, right? Where does this term came from, and why term this divides or conflict as polarization? So, there are many different reasons to try to understand polarization, but the main one is that it became some sort of a buzzword. It became a buzzword that kind of like encompasses everything and anything that can divide us as a society. So it basically suggests that everything that is bad in the society amounts to some levels of polarization. So we can think about the economy, why our money is worth less. Okay, it's because polarization. It's because economics, institutions, and countries are polarized. Climate change, why these things happen? Oh, it happens because we don't devote enough money to fight climate change. Why does that happen? Because the public opinion is polarized about climate change. The same things happens with COVID, right? We saw that there is a polarization. And I see it even, you know, when I walked yesterday to the pharmacy and the person in front of me says, oh, I got the flu, it's a nasty flu. And then she turned to me and she said, you know why I got the flu? And I was like, oh, why? And she said, because not every people in the United States get vaccinated. And you know why that happens? And then I got a lecture, which I probably could fit in here, about the problems of why people do or do not vaccinate themselves. And all of these issues eventually boils down to why we're so polarized. So what I'll try to argue today is that polarization is some sort of an umbrella term. It encompasses many different behaviors and opinions and ideas and attitudes individuals, groups, institutions, countries, collectives share or not share. And by talking about polarization, we need to understand a little bit better exactly what are we talking about and exactly who are we talking about. And this is basically the motivation for this activity. So what are the practical implications of polarization on our lives? So there are gazillion practical implications. I focused on the major four that I think that are important and we encounter usually, but there are many, many more. We encounter polarization in public discourse, right? So we can think of polarization as shaping how people communicate and interact in public spaces. And we can see that by, for example, increasing levels of hostility in some certain discourses in certain contexts, or decreasing level of hostility on other aspects. Specifically in social media, which will be the topic of our next session. We can see the practical implications of polarization as eroding trust in institutions. And again, polarization can undermine the confidence the public has in certain institutions like the government, like the health systems, like science in general. And we saw that, for example, in the election result, and we saw that, for example, during COVID. Polarization also affects our social and political stability, right? In the sense that it can destabilize democracies and create long-term societal rifts towards different aspects that we don't really want to see maybe. And it can also manifest in the rise of extreme politics. And economic impacts are also impacts that we see that are affected by polarization, as it can disrupt cooperation that is needed in order to make collective decisions, or even to cooperate between institutions, between countries, between different states in order to achieve mutual goals and economic prosperity. But maybe polarization is not necessarily negative. So we have also voices saying that polarization, we always think about it as some sort of a phenomenon that is bad, but maybe it's not a phenomenon, maybe it's a symptom of a society that actually allows different groups from the society to have a voice and standing in this society. So maybe polarization is an indication of a diverse society that allows different opinions, that maybe allows changes of opinions. It's also debatable, but this is something that we should think about if we really want to dig into what exactly is polarization. So the question of what is polarization refers to many different disciplines that try to encompass the idea of, okay, polarization, who it refers to, and what exactly are we talking about. So I brought here a few books. I don't know if people read books in these formats anymore, but I think you can find it in like, Kindles and stuff like that. So the first book is written by, this is just, there's many books. I brought three that I really liked and I thought kind of influenced the way we think about polarization. So the first one is written by a journalist, Ezra Klein, and he says that polarization is a phenomenon of the system. So basically the problem is that our systems, our political systems, our health systems, our public systems are polarized, and individuals just play the parts that they should within those systems. A different perspective coming from mostly social psychology talks about the self as an element that is socially construed. And in this perspective, we can think about the impact those systems or groups have on our individual personality, the things we identify with, our social identities, our national identities, and so on. And a third book that I think is really interesting if you're interested in history of United States is a book that's written by a historian that talks about the disorder of America, and basically talks about the origin of the myth of the red and blue and where did it came from and why it affects so much current politics. So just to name a few of the approaches of polarization, and the thing is that polarization is not only an umbrella term of many other aspects, but it also can be divided to different subtypes or kinds of polarization. So some people talk about group polarization, for example, which is the tendency of individuals within a group to adopt more extreme positions in order to try to follow the group discussions. This is an approach that is usually incorporated in sociology or in psychology. On the other hand, we have political polarization, which is what most newspapers and news notions talk about, and it is the movement of political attitudes towards ideological extremes, and those political attitudes can refer to either political parties or individuals. And this comes from political science mostly, public policy sometimes. We have social polarization, which is the process by which a society becomes more divided into different groups, and we have affective polarization, which basically talks about how individuals develop different or negative, usually negative attitudes and feelings towards members of different political groups, or even just members of different groups. So the political does not necessarily has to be something in this definition of polarization. So when we talk about polarization, we usually talk about either political or ideological polarization when we talk about the context of politics, or when we talk about individuals, we're focusing mostly on affective polarization, which is basically how polarization affects our emotional states. And this is what I'm going to talk about mostly today. So digging a little deeper into the literature, this is what we academics do. I've tried to kind of snitch those different definitions of what polarization is from the literature. So again, giving you just a handful of examples. So we have this monumentous paper by Dominic Abrams. He's a social psychologist from the 90s. This is a very cited paper. And in this paper, Abrams and his colleagues define polarization as the outcome of individuals maintaining their social identity in a group. Notice the words in bold. And a different definition to polarization comes from the social demograph Permanier, and he argues that polarization is determined by individuals' feelings of involvement or alienation from other individuals in their in-group or out-group. We'll talk about this division in a second. And coming from political science, we have an understanding of polarization as an indicator of polarization is that the extent to which partisans view each other as disliked outgroups. So we see here that polarization is basically defined on these kind of like two levels. There's the individual level and there's the group level. And we can think about polarization as some sort of attitudes between individuals and their groups, or how groups affect those individuals. So one way to think about polarization is basically on occurring on two levels simultaneously. So there is individual polarization that refers to the hostility levels that individuals develop towards members of other groups. And we can also think about polarization as occurring on the collective level, right? As Recline suggests, the system level. And here it describes basically the degree of divisions between different groups. Now, another approach or perspective to view polarization, which has to do more about regarding how we measure polarization, is to think of polarization across this process and state divide. So on the one hand, when we read headlines that say the United States is polarized, but when we read the article more carefully, we see that basically there was one research about polarization, and it measured polarization at one point at a time, and okay, at that point at a time, it's basically contextless. We see that the public was divided, and this refers to polarization in a very static sort of way. So we can think about polarization levels of a general population at a given moment, and we can say, okay, at this moment, the public was polarized. But we can also think of polarization as some sort of a process, right? So when we measure polarization across different time shots, we can think about how polarization progresses, right? And how population polarization levels arise or decrease over time. So for example, if we measure polarization 6 months before the election, and then we measure it again 3 months before the election, and then we measure it again 2 weeks before the election, and then we measure it 1 month after the election, and then 1 year after the election, we can see the levels of polarization either rising, either decreasing, and we can start to thinking about how the general political atmosphere, cultural atmosphere, the things that happen in the world actually affect those different timelines and processes of polarization. So if we think basically of polarization as occurring in this some sort of 4 dimensions kind of perspective, we can think of polarization as occurring at the individual level and the collective level, but it can also be moving from a process to a state, and that really depends on how you measure it. So some problems with measuring polarization that we'll hopefully talk about in the next session has to do with how do you actually conclude what are the levels of polarization, or to which amount polarization has risen or decreased if you measure polarization levels on the individual level. So do we think of the polarization level of a group as just an aggregate of the different measurements of its individuals? And how deeply do we actually trust individuals to give the correct information regarding the levels of polarization at a given time? So problems with measurement has a lot to do with thinking about polarization in both the individual and the collective levels, and also in moving it through the process state spectrum. Now, you can see here that there are, again, just a handful of social elements that I picked that contribute to how we think about polarization. So for examples, we have beliefs that occur at the individual level, but are also shaped by the groups that we're a part of, the people we interact with, the institutions that we join. And those beliefs operate and shape our polarization levels, again, both on the individual and the collective levels. We can say the same thing about the levels of diversity that a society has. So we can think about whether we grew up in a relatively diverse societies. It means that we'll be more open to people that are not like us. So maybe we're prone to be less polarized to begin with. But on the other hand, if we grew up in a society that is very, very homogenic, and we're used to seeing people that are really similar to us, as soon as we move towards a different aspect in our lives, we might encounter people that are different from us, and we might develop those attitudes that will differentiate us from other people, while these differentiations might not be true at all. But we still have this kind of like tendencies because we grew up in a society that is more homogenic and less diverse. The same thing goes about values. Again, values on the individual level and values on the group level that change according to the groups that we're part of. But specifically, there are 3 social elements that affect polarization in more concrete ways than other elements. And these elements are social norms, social identities, and individual and group emotions. Now, each of these elements also operate on the individual and the collective levels. So norms, for example, we have norms that we internalize and as soon as we are, very, very young. And so, for example, when my 3-year-old kid says at dinner, Mom, you don't talk during dinner. I was like, okay, so this is something that my 3 years old definitely obtained this social norm in his kindergarten, and kind of like projected this social norm again in the same setting. He identifies that he sits near a table, that he eats dinner, that he eats something, and in his preschool they told him not to talk during lunchtime. So he immediately does the same thing and say, okay, Mommy, why are you talking during dinner time? So we internalize norms at a very, very young age, and those norms can actually become goals in themselves. So we become committed to certain norms. They actually become part of our personalities, and this operates within the individual level. But as we grow up, we tend to join different groups, we encounter different people, and we start to understand the norms of the groups that we belong to. And then we develop norms or embrace norms that are not necessarily norms that we're deeply committed to, but that they are norms that reflect our social identification. So if I want to signal that I'm part of a group, I might behave in a way that I won't necessarily behave if I would just be in my family gatherings or some other workplace or maybe, but I would embrace those normative behaviors just to signal that I'm part of this group. So norms operate on individual and group levels. Emotions and identities are two topics that I'm going to talk more in much more extensive way today. So I'll start with discussing social identities, and we'll talk about social identities. Again, think about identities as operating on the individual and the collective levels, and this might seem some sort of intuitive to some extent, but on the other hand, we're not necessarily thinking about our identities when those identities become salient. So sometimes just being more aware of which identities are actually now in play might affect our own attitudes towards polarization and towards encountering other individuals that might be different from us. So starting with social identities. So social identities basically derive from social identity theory, which is a theory that was developed in the early 1970s by the social psychologist Henry Tajfel and his colleagues, and they found out that people tend to immediately categorize themselves and others into different categories and different groups based on very random and meaningless assignments. Now, the idea here is that social identity is actually a process that develops through 3 mental stages. Now, the first stage is called social categorization. So when we meet someone, we immediately tend to categorize him to belonging to like these boxes or one of these groups that we're already familiar with. So for example, students, professors. We can also think about men, women, humanities, STEM, and whatever context you're in. We immediately tend to do this kind of like categorization processes. The second process is social identification. So we start to identify the groups that we belong to, and we start to identify the norms that are parts of these groups, and we start to behave according to those norms. Again, it does not mean that we are very committed to those norms or that we like internalize those norms, but it means that we want to signal that we understand our group belonging and we want to belong to this group or do not want to belong to that group. And the third mental process is social comparison. So once we established which groups we belong to and which groups we do not, we maintain a feeling of superiority of our group by starting to differentiate ourselves, right? Saying, okay, we do things this way because we're so enlightened and they're just barbaric. They don't know what they're doing. And this kind of like differentiation helps us both reinforce our own self-esteem as part of the group, but it also helps us to immediately create those divisions in order to understand who's the people that we should interact with and who not. Now, a significant part of this categorization and identification processes is the idea of in-groups and out-groups. Now, this is also a terminology that was coined by the same Turner and Tajfel that came out with the idea of social identities, and they claim that as people we have a tendency to categorize things, and when this tendency is applied to other people, we have a tendency to put them in, again, those kind of like boxes. Now, this in-group, out-group categorization tends to magnify the between-group differences, and it tends to understate within-group differences, which basically means that we tend to think of people that we categorize as part of our in-group as much more similar to us than they actually are. And on the same level, we tend to think about people from our out-groups as much more different than they actually are. The thing is that those identification and categorization processes are actually more flexible than we tend to think about. So there was a very nice experiment that put people in different groups, and they told them the categorizations that they were based on, for example, gender or race, and immediately those people identified the other people that were the same race or the same gender as they were, and they immediately categorized other people as belonging to their out groups. However, once a person from the in-group was interacting with a person from the out-group, and they were told that they shared another identity that they actually have in common, for example, professional identity. So they told them that they both were lawyers, or they're both facing the same problem at work. Immediately, those categorizations started to melt, and people identified more with the people that they shared those professional or social identities with than the other kind of like harsh in-group, out-group categorization. So the idea about categorization is that on the one hand, we have this some sort of like intuitive tendency to categorize people into those groups, but we also have the ability to change those categorization. And these processes constantly occur as we get to know people and as we talk to people and as we sometimes being forcefully coerced into a room to talk with different people that have different opinions about things that are very, very against our own ideas or our own views. But we might find those shareable identities with those people that might change our categorization of these people, but not only them, of other people that we see as similar to them. So this is kind of like an ongoing process of identification that changes categorization, and throughout these processes we can actually change our opinions, or at least our intuitive attitudes towards outgroups or towards people that we categorize to be our outgroups. Now, there's been quite a lot of research about how identity, or the priming of social identity and group identity, affects polarization. It has been argued that groups basically reinforce belonging and opposition. So once you belong to a certain group, you know that you're part of that group, but it immediately reinforces the opposition and the disbelonging to different groups. And it has been argued that polarization is intensified when identities are threatened. Again, this is somewhat debatable. We can talk a little bit more about that later. But the idea is basically that as long as some part of your identity is threatened, you tend to get more and more coerced within the group that this identity is the salient identity of, and you tend to get more polarized towards other group in order to try to maintain the threat in control. And other research show that priming social identity reinforces negative attitudes towards outgroups. So let's take a look at one of many. Okay, I'm just picking this one because it's interesting and it's relevant to our work. And it's about how national identity and polarization actually affect each other. So this research was done was published in 2018. It was conducted in 2016, right after the elections. And the researchers wanted to better understand how priming national identity, which is part of social identity, but is not necessarily the same thing. So we need to think a little bit carefully when we talk about identities, because this is also some sort of an umbrella term that encompasses many different identities. But let's assume, for the sake of this argument, that national identity is very similar to social identity. So they want to know how, by priming social identity, it influenced the effective polarization levels of individuals. And they hypothesize that immigration opponents that are primed to think about their national identity will basically exhibit greater effective polarization than those who are not primed to think about their national identity. So the experiment was conducted, as I mentioned, in 2016, a great year to conduct experiments. Ezra Klein's book was also published as a result of 2016, where many people try to basically explain how Trump got elected, why Hillary was not elected, what actually happened here when we didn't see any kind of changes in the political discourse. So this experiment was conducted in the U.S. It contained 218 individuals. 47% of them were women. The average age was 47, so this is not a college students' research. And 51% identified as conservative. Now, the 200 people were basically divided to two groups, the prime group and the control group. The prime group was told to take a few minutes before the experiment began and to think about what unites us as a nation, what does it mean to be an American, and to write a couple of sentences of what do they think that, that America is great of. The control group was not told anything, and then after that, after those 4 minutes, all of them were moved to logging in into some sort of a fake news site. This fake news site contained 16 articles. 6 of them were pro-immigration articles, 6 of them were anti-immigration articles, and the 4 remaining articles were about sports and lifestyle and so on. And after they spent about 5 minutes in this fake news site, and then they were moved to this post questionnaire when they were asked about their attitudes about living next to immigrants, what do they think about immigrants in general, whether they think they share the same groups with immigrants or the same identities with immigrants, and so on. And the results showed that those who were primed with national identity, those that thought about what unites us as a nation, read twice as many anti-immigration papers or articles than the control group. And it showed that at least in 3 of the 4 major aspects that they were asked about, those who are primed to think about national identity exhibit more polarized attitudes. So, for example, in order to assess their negative trait evaluation, they were asked to which extent do they think illegal immigrants in the US are honest, intelligible, trustworthy, good, and hardworking. And the higher values indicate more negative evaluation. So if we go back, we see here that, for example, each one of the yellow, green, purple indicates a different question. And we see that in each of them, we see that those that were primed to think about national identity exhibit usually positive values as opposed to negative values, or lower negative values as opposed to larger negative values. They were asked about negative trait evaluations. Another question they were asked about was in order to assess their common group identity. So they were asked to share their opinions about how do they feel about a sentence. American citizens and immigrants represent different groups. And in this case, again, they thought that they represent very different groups. And in order to assess their in-group favorability, they were asked to share their feelings towards illegal immigrants currently in the US. And again, we see that they shared that their feelings were much more negative towards illegal immigrants. Surprisingly, though, in the social distance aspect, they exhibit no statistically significant difference. So while they think very badly about illegal immigrants and they think that they share very different identities, apparently they don't mind living next to immigrants. Now, this paper, which is just one of many papers, shows that by priming national identities, there are at least 3 processes that are affected. So first of all, it enhances the differences between the in-groups and the out-groups. So it immediately turns into us versus them in terms of US citizens versus immigrants, even though those people maybe did not know any specific immigrant when they talked about, or they shared an identity of those immigrants as a general population without specifying any specific individual or group. It also made them focus on the negative traits of the outgroup, which is one of the outcomes that we talked about that comes from this in-group, out-group categorization. And this obviously led to greater in-group favorability. So it means that basically once we categorize people as different from us, we develop much more positive attitudes towards those that we feel are like us, in this case, US citizens and immigrants, and we develop negative attitudes toward those that from our out-group, in this case, the immigrants. Now, each of these processes alone affects polarization negatively, and all of them together obviously lead to higher levels of polarization. So we see here that polarization levels rise when we provoke individuals' national identities, when we talk to them about their social identities, when we start to categorize or create those kind of fake categorization processes that eventually turn to actual polarization processes. And the question that arises here is basically who is polarized? So when we talk about measuring polarization, we usually talk about measuring polarization levels on individuals. But those individuals constantly are asked about their attitudes towards groups. What do they think about immigrants? What do you think about political parties? What do you think about pro-choice? What do you think about pro-life? You never measure polarization in individuals when you talk about a specific individual, usually, right? You can measure attitudes towards Trump, right? But you never do that when you try to better assess the levels of polarization. So we have individuals that are expressing those attitudes or those polarized attitudes, but those attitudes are expressed towards groups. On the other hand, we have groups that also play a significant part in polarization, just by merely being there, but also by enforcing processes of group belonging and group identification. And those processes affect the individuals that are parts of the groups. So now the question is, how do groups possess or have this sort of power over individuals? Or more concretely, how do groups shape individuals' emotions towards other individuals and groups? So there are several mechanisms by which individuals shape emotions. But maybe we'll just have a quick pause for maybe questions, if you have so far, because I feel like I've been talking for a while now. So, any questions?
I've got one quick one about
Yeah.
the temporality of that little nudge.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, you're in, we're reminding you of your national sentiment. What are your thoughts or feelings about how long that little nudge lasts for? And is there any instances where temporality just is totally diminished and it never really goes away?
So it's a good question. I think that the problem with, and you talk about this kind of like static, right, state process kind of division. So I think that the problem with thinking about polarization in terms of a state or like a snapshot is that it takes polarization as something that basically comes out of nowhere. But it never is. So polarization is always coming from something. It can be either a major cultural or political event like an eruption of war. And it can also come by slowly boiling processes like political division growing and the general public opinion transcending towards something or moving towards something else. And again, it can be caused by like a pandemic, but it can also be something that happens, you know, in the dark, besides the headlight. So I think that in order to really understand polarization, we need to take those snapshots. We need to take those kind of like polarization state indicator to understand what's going on. Because when you measure polarization, it's always in snapshots. You can't measure processes, or at least we can't still measure processes, you know, unless doing kind of like Big Brother kind of thing. But we need to take those snapshots into context. And taking them into context usually mean doing many snapshots and thinking about them in terms of the political and social and cultural context in which we measure them. So for example, one of the problems that political scientists faced with when they try to measure those snapshots is that when you do, you have two basic methods that you use to measure polarization. Survey methods, survey-based methods, and behavioral methods. So the survey method is just that, right? So you call people, or you don't call them these days, you send them an email, and they answer this questionnaire where they have to evaluate their own opinions towards something, or how do they feel towards this or that, topics that are rising, so it can be climate change, it can be vaccination, it can be anything of those. And the problem is that people don't necessarily answer those questionnaires in a trustworthy kind of way. So sometimes, and it really depends on where do these people come from. If they open your email right after they got off of a heated debate in social media with this like a Trump opponent or Trump whatever, and they have those emotions and they come and answer your questionnaire in a very specific sort of way. Sometimes people answer this questionnaire in order to reinforce their own identity, which is not necessarily what they think, but what the groups that they belong to believe they should think. So these surveys are not that accurate. And the problem with those surveys is, again, that they kind of like measure this snapshot. So if we want to at least better measure polarization, and this is extremely difficult, right? It's not like a suggestion that comes lightly. We need to think about measuring polarization both in terms of individuals, but also attempting to measure polarization in terms of groups. So get people together and ask them what they feel about a certain opinion, taking into consideration that some people will be those that have more like prominent roles in those groups will have a better voice, but to get an opinion out of a group and also to get an opinion out of individuals, and then try to better understand what exactly are the differences and what exactly are we measuring. Because in some circumstances, we might find out that a group that consists of 10 people might think that it is pro-choice. But when you ask each individual, each of them is actually pro-life, but there is one individual that is very dominant. Or they think that they belong to this greater institution that is pro-choice or pro-life, and they feel that they have to change their opinion according to that. And this exactly leads us to the question of how groups, oh, you have another question, yes?
Yeah, but it's slightly different, so I don't want to...
No, go ahead.
I was really interested in kind of this idea that like kind of priming kind of some of identity leads to polarization. I was wondering if there was any research or if that article study did address it. Do you feel kind of like what type of identity is primed and the characteristics of that prime affect the polarization? Because even I was just thinking of kind of the priming of American identity. If it's being primed in a way that brings to mind ideas of like kind of bootstraps and meritocracy versus being primed in a way of give us you're tired and you're hungry, if there's difference, particularly in relation to immigration, but just if like kind of the type of the identity being primed matters and which characteristics of that identity are being primed matter to how it relates to polarization.
So yeah, it's a great question, and in this specific paper, they just prime national identity in general, which again goes to say what exactly is national identity in a country like the United States. So they tried to get people that are third generation American born, but again, you still see that even people that are third generations here, they carry on their legacies and then cultural habits that comes from their grandmothers and their great-great-mothers. So it's a really difficult issue to try to better understand what aspects of identity, national identity actually plays, and what exactly is this national identity when we talk about a state that basically is built of immigrants, and if it's not built of immigrants today, then it was built of immigrants 100 years ago, which is not that long when we talk about identities and nationalities and how they pave their path into our own states of mind. So I think it's a very interesting question to come back and explore in 20 years and in 50 years and try to, again, do those snapshots, but over time, right? So we think about what is national identity and what role does it play today. Maybe we can think about what role did it play during the Cold War or during the great election dividers or something like that. And we can also think about its impact in future processes. So basically, it's so difficult to even pinpoint which aspects of national identity you're actually studying, that I think those experiments are very, very hard to do. But it's definitely something that, since we're doing here conceptual, or at least I'm doing a conceptual work, it's super important to note exactly this difference, because what might come across as something positive that primes national identity to certain Americans and makes them think about what unites us as a nation will basically lead to other, again, born Americans thinks about what unites us as a nation, nothing, right? So priming identities can also have a negative effect on this kind of like in-group attitudes supposedly that we develop. And this is a super interesting point that has to be taken into account when we talk about identities in general. And besides national identities, right, so we have many different identities, right? So we have cultural identities and we have personal identities, which is, again, this some sort of an amalgam between our social identities and group identities, but something that we are born with to some extent, our personality, the things that we believe that are part of who we are, the self. And this thing is also shaped by so many different aspects. So when we talk about identity in general, and specifically national identities, there are so many other elements that play a part with that. So it's basically another problematic term that we use to explain polarization, which is another problematic term. So problems causes more problems, and here we're faced with the unknown. But yeah, it's a great comment. Okay, so we talked a little bit about social identity and intergroup dynamics as those aspects that kind of shape emotions, or through which groups shape emotions, right? So by feeling or reinforcing feelings of identification with the group, and by creating those intergroup dynamics where our group is the best and other groups are so barbaric and horrific, we create these feelings of pride and of wanting to belong to the group. So these are two mechanisms that groups use in order to shape the emotions of individuals that belong to them. Another mechanism is social norms. So for example, if a group has a goal or decided to devote all its efforts towards hating a certain idea or being opposed to a certain institution, it can develop norms that eventually will differentiate between individuals that are part of the group and are not part of the group. So if supposedly you have to hate people with blue shirts in order to be part of the group, you have to exhibit these norms. So you necessarily have to behave badly towards people with blue shirts. You have to not look them in the eye. You have to disregard whatever they say. You might even have to talk to them in a very firm and assertive way that will make no doubt that you're opposed to them. And this way you're signaling that you're part of the group. And in this way, social norms that, again, serve the group goals affects individuals' feelings. So when the norm was first implemented, you didn't necessarily have any strong feelings towards people with blue shirts. As time progresses, and as you see that by getting and developing those negative attitudes towards people with blue shirts, you become more and more accepted in the group. People in the group develop those nice and affirmative attitudes towards you. You start to actually hate people with blue shirts with no reason. There is basically no logical reason besides the idea that you want to show how you belong to the group. You don't want to lose some sort of a very warm affirmative feeling that the group gives you. So this is how groups can shape individuals' emotions through social norms as one tool, for example. And another tool, there are many other tools, right? So just again, 4 prominent tools, but They're just a handful. And another tool is by using something that is called emotion regulation. So groups can operate as regulating emotions in different ways. So one way that groups can do that is by using what is called group-based emotions. Now, group-based emotions refer basically to emotions that individuals experience due to their membership or identification with the group, and those group-based emotions shape both in-group attitudes and both out-group relations. So, for example, if we think about people that protesting against something as a group, I, as an individual that is part of the group, may not hold these firm opinions about this thing that we're protesting against, but I will do that in order to show that I'm part of the group. And again, throughout time and while getting into the motion of a protest, I might even express real anger, even though I'm not necessarily angry, but I will express this anger to be part of the group. And this is the points where group can shape my emotions, even though I'm not entirely committed to feeling angry towards this specific goal that we're protesting against. Another example is expressing sadness on Memorial Days. So some people might not actually feel sad. Other people might feel sad, but they do not necessarily express sadness in the same way that we expect them to do. But these people will behave as they think they should. They will cry. They will express facial expression of sadness. They will not tell jokes. They usually used to tell in some sort of memorial ceremonies and stuff like that, in order, again, to show that they are part of the group. So the group can regulate this kind of emotions into like triggering sadness, which is basically, when you think about it, it's an emotion that it's triggered by many different mental aspects, things that happen to us, thoughts that cross our minds. But for all of us as a nation to instantly become sad on a certain date sounds a bit weird, sounds a bit not like emotions behaving, right? So I wish I could control my sadness and just, be sad when I want to and be happy when I want to, but I don't really do that. But again, when we are part of a society, when we're part of a collective that says, okay, in this date, you all have to think about all the soldiers that gave up their lives for us, we get sad. We get sad. And this is, again, part of how groups control and shape our emotions. Now, the process of emotion regulation actually happens through modifying one's emotional experience or expressions to basically achieve a certain emotional state. Now, these states usually serves as elements to serve group-related goals, and they usually derive from two different motivations. The first is hedonic goals, we can call them, and it's basically seeking pleasure or avoiding discomfort. So we can think about those Celtics fans that are all cheering for their favorite basketball team in order to reinforce their social identity and collective feeling of joy. So if I find myself in the Celtics game, even though I'm not a Celtics fan at all, but I came with my husband, I wanted to eat the hot dogs, I don't know, and then all of the people express this kind of like, wow, joyful when I don't know, someone with a green shirt probably shoots the basket to the correct hoop, which is basically what it means to me. I will be part of this enormous joy. I will feel that this kind of like waves of joy, even though I don't care, this kind of waves of joy go through me because this is part of a collective feeling, this is a collective emotion. Another motivation that is definitely different from hedonic goals is instrumental goals, and this is basically refers to achieving practical or strategic benefits for the group. And the example here is, for example, to think about how highlighting stories of discrimination or sexual harassment are used to evoke anger in certain groups' members, and this is used in order to motivate them to act against some systematic errors or some systematic inequalities and stuff like that. But the thing is that so far we talked about this power that the group has on individuals, but all these things that the group does actually affects individuals in real life. So it actually affects how people change their emotions. But why? Why do people change their emotions, right? We can think about individuals that, would behave according to what society thinks they should, but actually will hold very different emotions than they should be, right? These people sometimes called sociopaths, right? It's people that are not necessarily endorsing and embracing the right or the fitting emotions for certain situations. But these people are not the majority. The majority of people actually changes their own emotions. But why? So there's a vast, again, a whole lot of experiments done on that topics. There's a great paper by Ronnie Porat and her colleagues that talk about these kind of like 5 elements of why people regulate emotions. And among the many different reasons for people to regulate emotions, some do it in order to strengthen or weaken their connection to the group. Others do it in order to influence in-group relation or to assert their dominance. So if some people want to move up higher in the social hierarchy levels and they want to get more known within the group, or they want to influence other group members, they start to regulate their emotions to show exactly what the group expects them to be or what leaders in the groups expect them to show. And other people do it in order to shape the perception of the in-group. So some people really, really care about how others perceive the groups that they are part of, and in order to maintain this feeling of superiority and of achievements, people want to regulate their emotions and see how it actually shines over their group. And others do it to influence group policies and relations with outgroups. So some people want to actually move other groups together, and they say, okay, so I will regulate my emotions in order to promote some sort of goals, in order to create these relationships with people from outgroups. And this is just a list of why different reasons of why people regulate their emotions. But if we think again about the thing that I wanted to think about from the get-go, this kind of like individual collective spectrum, we see here again that emotion regulation also occurs in these kind of like 2 levels, right? So there's individual emotions, like basic emotions that happen to individuals, like happiness or sadness, but there are also social emotions, for example, like guilt or shame. And these emotions are emotions that individuals usually feel in order to reflect something about their social status. So individuals usually express feelings of shame or guilt to signal their groups that they know that they did something wrong, and they really still want to be a part of this group, so please forgive them. So for example, if we disobey a certain norm or do something that the group does not approve of, in order to still maintain our belonging and reinforce that to our group, we have to show some sort of remorse. And by exhibiting guilt or shame, or even by blushing, these kind of signals actually indicate other people that we're either ashamed of what we didn't mean to, and it basically tells them that we still want to be a part of this group, even though we disobeyed maybe some of the norms. So again, we see that there is some sort of a connection or interactions between emotions on the group level and emotions on the individual level. And in the same way that those interactions occurred in the social identity and group identity, and in the same way that those interactions occur in polarization in the collective level and in the group level, they occur here and they interact with each other. So the idea that I kind of want to leave you here is, first of all, in thinking about polarization as an aspect that is influenced by emotions, identities, national identities, norms, and different social aspects, but also as an element similar to other elements that operate on at least these 2 levels of individuals and collectives. So a quick recap of what we talked about today. So we went over several definitions of polarization, and we talked about the individual collective divide of polarization. We talked about how social identity affects polarization, and we talked about the in-group, out-group categorization and how this categorization basically shapes our identities and also affects levels of polarization. Within that, we talked about national identity, with the problems of national identity and how we define it and how it affects polarization. And we eventually discussed a little bit about group emotions and how group emotions affect individuals and different levels of polarization. So next Wednesday, we're going to talk about how different other aspects affect polarization. We're going to talk a little bit about how social media affect polarization, and how AI, again, another buzzword of our time, can and does shape polarization in many different ways that were unthinkable of, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. And we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges to overcoming polarization, social challenges, personal, individual challenges, and challenges that we have as a nation and challenges that we have as a world. And we'll talk about possible solutions to polarization and whether we want those solutions or not, like from a normative perspective. That's it. Thank you so much.